Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the 2022 Georgetown Women's Forum virtual series. I'm Rachel Baxter. I'm the Associate Director of Alliances here at Georgetown, and I'll be helping to facilitate today's event here from the back end. We are so excited to get started. The Georgetown University Women's Forum celebrates Georgetown women from each of the 9 schools, and it provides an opportunity for Georgetown alum from across the country and abroad to share experiences, ideas, and expertise around women and gender issues. Today's latest session is Putting Pen to Paper, the Writing Journey. We are so excited to see so many of you joining us virtually this afternoon. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. Before we dive in, just want to go over a few quick housekeeping notes and introduce our panelists to you all. This conversation is being recorded. The recording will be made available on YouTube, and you will receive the recording link in a follow-up email, of course. We have a really exciting session and discussion planned for you today, but if a question for our panel comes to mind, please feel free to submit that using the question section of the webinar control panel anytime throughout the webinar, and we'll save some time at the end for some audience questions. Lastly, if you have any technical difficulties, any issues, you can go ahead and submit those concerns via the questions section as well, and our team will try our best to help you troubleshoot. So we have a fabulous panel of alumni today who are ready to share their experiences and their insight with you. Welcome to Julia Cook, a 2005 grad and author of The Other Side of Paradise, Life in the New Cuba, and Come Fly the World, the jet age story of the women of Pan Am. Julia's essays have been published in A Public Space, Salon, the Three Penny Review, Smithsonian, Tin House, and the Virginia Quarterly Review, where she's a contributing editor. And her reporting has been published in Condé Nast Traveler, the New York Times, Playboy, The Village Voice, and many more. We have Alicia Kelly, pen name Lee Kelly, a 2002 grad and author of City of Savages and A Criminal Magic, with 2 additional co-authored novels already in the works, set to be released in the summer of 2023 with HarperCollins. She has contributed to Tour.com, Writer's Digest, and other venues, and is a climate reality project leader and a Citizens Climate Lobby member. We also have Erica Suter, a 1997 grad and nationally recognized voice in parenting news and in parenting advice with over 20 years of journalism experience. Erica is the author of How to Have a Kid and Life, a Survival Guide. She is a regular contributor on Good Morning America and other national broadcast outlets, as well as The Bump, What to Expect, Cafe Mom, and Mom.com. Erica has also been featured in People, US Weekly, Essence, Cosmopolitan, Self, and WebMD magazines. And of course, today's conversation is being moderated by Mary Giuliani, a 1997 Georgetown grad. Mary is the founder and CEO of Mary Giuliani Catering and Events, and is the author of The Cocktail Party, Eat, Drink, Play, and Recover, as well as Tiny Hot Dogs, a memoir in small bites. Mary has appeared on Billions, The Barefoot Contessa, The Today Show, Good Morning America, and is a regularly featured guest on The Rachel Ray Show. So thank you so much to all of you for being here with us today. But without further ado, I'm very excited to go ahead and turn it over to Mary. Kick things off. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and to Bridget, the angel of Georgetown, for bringing together such an amazing group of women. I am honored to share this space with you today. Like I said, I wish we were all together, but we will do that too. But Bridget, you did a great job. Oh, and of course, thanking the Georgetown Entertainment and Media Alliance, Ways and Letters, and the Women's Forum. Yay to all of us. I'm so grateful to be with you guys as we, this accomplished group of, we have such a mixed group here. We are journalists, we're essay writers, we are novelists, so I think we're cookbook writers, we've covered so much territory here to share with you. And my hope is that anyone out there listening today who has that idea, who has that thing that keeps them up at night, that book inside of them, that story inside of them that needs to come out, that something we do or say today gives you the strength and courage to just fly with it. So I hope that's the goal, I think. For me, and we've all gone through the last 2 years of craziness, and I'm happy we're all coming out together. And I never was more grateful for my practice of writing during this time, especially when I was hiding in the closet from my family, with my computer. But writing for me, I think the greatest joy was that it's the ability to travel without going anywhere. If you could sit down with yourself and your keys or your paper and pad and paper and go somewhere, that I think was the greatest gift I had during the pandemic. So I wish you all great travels of going somewhere without going anywhere. But today we're going to go everywhere. So let's start with our amazing fellow authors. Okay, so the first question, and I guess should we do it like in boxes? Should we, so how I'm looking, I've got Erica, Alicia, Julia. Well, maybe the first one will, I don't know, or just raise your hand if you're dying to answer this first. Okay. It is everyone's question. We all have stories, like I said, we all want to be writers. What does the book find you? Do you find that first book? Let's talk specifically about the first book right now, the first big idea. What was the moment that you said, I must write this book? So I would love to know, where you were standing, what you were doing when you were like, I got to share this with the world.
Okay. So a lot of people always say, write what you know, but for me, I wrote the book that I needed. When I write about motherhood and parenthood. And I was an editor at Cafe Mom at the time, and I wrote this article about the mom gene. There was this research that had been done at Rockefeller University that found a mom gene in mice and was applicable to women. And basically, if this gene wasn't activated, you weren't as nurturing, or you weren't as desperate to be a mother, and you didn't have this like natural maternal instinct. And I kind of felt that was a little bit like me. I didn't feel like motherhood was so natural. So I didn't do a lot of writing. I was editing at the time, but I wrote this article, and it was called "Is Discovery of the Mom Gene the Reason Some of Us Don't Crave Having Kids?" And the reaction was huge. Like, so many women wrote to me saying, oh my gosh, I feel the same way, but I'm embarrassed to say it, or I do always feel like such, a monster if I say like motherhood's not natural, I don't have maternal instinct. So that was like the seed that was planted for me to write about topics that moms don't usually talk about or are hesitant to talk about, and kind of create this community of like, it's okay to express ambivalence or concern or worry, and also try to find solutions for it, not just, complain about it, but to also find ways that you can kind of work around it or make your life better. So I wrote the book that I think that I needed versus.
I think that you wrote the book that you needed. I love that.
Yeah, and I actually have a somewhat similar story, which is not about the book that I needed, but I wrote about the book that, my first book was about youth culture in Cuba, and it was born out of, when I was at Georgetown, I studied abroad in Havana, and when I came back from my senior year, I wanted to learn everything about the place, and so I took a poli-sci course on contemporary Cuba, and I didn't really recognize the Cuba that I had seen and known. So again, I wrote the book that I would have wanted to read, the book that to me captured a place that had not really been captured in print until then. But I think that Erica's point is totally apt. You write the book that you wish you could have read, or that you feel like you need.
And I'll go last because I feel like I never have a great, or I sort of have an adjacent answer to this question. My aha moment, it was more of a personal epiphany, I think, than it was to do with the content of that particular book. I was definitely that kid that, at 6 or 7 was like binding my own books and like, creating my own newsletters. I always wanted to be a writer. I think in my 8th grade yearbook, it says, writer. And I just, that for forever, that's what I wanted to do. And I know we were talking before this panel that I went to law school, which I think sometimes a lot of writers are sort of guided to that path. And so, and I was also a kid that would write tons of chapter 1s. Like I had never finished a story. I came up with the idea, I would get excited about the idea, and all through college too. It was like, maybe I got to chapter 3 at one point, which was a huge deal. And I think then it was taking the California bar exam and getting ready to start my job, which was going to be 60, 70 plus hours a week, and realizing I had never truly committed to a writing practice. I, in my head, called myself a writer, but I think I was waiting for somebody to give me permission to actually write, or maybe there was some very complicated, combination of being afraid of failure or failing at the thing that I most wanted to do. And I realized it was sort of now or never. I had about 6 weeks before I moved out to LA to start my job. And if I wasn't going to spend an hour a day now, when was I going to? And so that was my aha moment. My first book ended up being like this near future thriller with featuring 2 sisters and their mother, and it was a ton of fun. But I think my real epiphany was to be a writer, you need to actually write.
Yeah. And that's often the hardest thing as a writer, is actually to write. We were talking before you guys all joined us, and the four of us were sharing, like, you know, if only I wrote as much as I think about writing, is a thing. I'll just answer my own question very quickly. Is I always say to people, I had to become a caterer to actually become a writer. I was an English major at Georgetown, theater minor. I was going to write comedy. I went to school and went to work in New York City after Georgetown, try to be an actress. And I took a job in a catering company and totally reshifted the focus of my dream and my life. But that writing was still there. And so when my first opportunity to write a cookbook came to me, and I'll tell you how that happens at some point, but all I wanted to do was write essays. I just wanted to share the essays that I've been writing all these years. And so I made sure that once I did the cookbook that I would, you know, be able to include these essays. But I remember writing that book too. It's writing the book that people needed. I wasn't a great cook, even though I owned a really successful catering company. I wanted to be able to teach people to entertain at home. And so I simplified it through that first book. So. Okay, so you had that moment. Okay, so great. We have the moment. We've committed to this. We have decided, okay, this book, I cannot live without this. I'm going to read it. I'm going to put it out there. Okay, so now what? Like, how, you know, that's great. That's fine and dandy that you tell all your friends and your parents, I'm going to write a book. How do you actually get this book in people's hands? And I think that is, you know, the bazillion-dollar question. How do you know, does it start with a proposal? Does it start with an idea? Is it just an outline? And then once that occurs, how do you get that agent to notice you? How do you get that essay to be published in a magazine? How do you, can you talk about like your first break or the tenacity that you had to follow up on, you know, submission letters or searching for an agent or anything tangible we can talk about to our listeners and viewers about how do you take it from that idea that keeps you up at night to actually putting it in someone's hands? Yes, Alicia.
Sure, I'm happy to go because I already admitted that I get to chapter 1 and then stall out. So I'll use my first book as sort of my path because that is the book that I ended up getting an agent with, and I think I started first just exploring the idea a little bit. And again, I had mentioned that just taking an hour a day. And for me, those small bites, if you will, like the manageable chunks are super important because I think looking down the long path of 350 pages for a novel, you stop before you start. So I started doing that for a while, just exploring the idea on my own. And then I'm going to date myself here, but I took a Media Bistro course, which I didn't have any writer friends or beta readers, if you will, and that introduced me to a huge group of writers. I think there were 12 of us, and the course structured it so that we would swap pages. And just by getting to know the people's work, I got to know them, and I really recommend either a class like that or joining a group like SCBWI if you write for children or romance writers, something like that, because they will help you create a group of writers to either swap work with or just hold each other accountable. It's one thing to say, I'm going to write 2 hours today. But if you tell somebody else that, if you pledge that, I think that helps along the journey. It's a very long journey and it can be a lonely journey, right? Without, I think, accountability partners or writing buddies or what have you. And so I feel like I answered the first part of the question, but the next part is the agent, or did you sort of want to go through everybody's process? Or
yeah, I guess go ahead, Julia.
I can jump off of that because I think, first of all, I totally second your accountability notion. I don't think you ever outgrow that, ever. I at least, to this day, I have a friend that I swap every single day the writing that we've done with. So that's, I mean, not weekends, obviously, we're not crazy. But I think you're also, like, your Media Bistro course is really important. I, got my start as a journalist, and I was, writing for different publications out of Mexico City. So I had a fairly large clip, collection by the time I wanted to be publishing my book, but I felt like it was really very cloak and dagger. There really was not a lot of practical information about how to go about getting an agent. And so taking a course like that, Media Bistro may no longer exist. I don't even know if it does. but there's Paragraph New York, there's Grub Street out of Boston. There are online courses all over the place. If you just Google, book proposal online course, you'll find them. And I think taking a course like that is an incredibly valuable investment, because even if you have a group of writer friends, or even if you think you know something about it, again, I had tons of writer friends. I was working as a journalist, but still the act of jumping from shorter pieces to a book felt really unmanageable. And I didn't feel like I could ask questions of anyone. So, to be involved in something whose purpose is to ask questions and answer questions, I think is really important and really valuable.
So for me, I did have a lot of writer friends because I started my career at People magazine as a writer. So there were a lot of people I knew who had tried to write books or screenplays or that kind of thing. So I reached out to my good friends and asked for advice. And I think what I learned, if you're publishing in magazines is very different than book publishing. And I think if you're doing a nonfiction book, the way you go about getting an agent or what you prepare is different than if you're doing a fiction book. So for me, for nonfiction, I did write a proposal, and it was about 50 pages. And it kind of, I like, Julia said, I bought tons of books on how to write a proposal. And the first one was probably incredibly awful. So it went through several different drafts before it kind of looked good. And then what I did was I also bought this book, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it, but there's a book that comes out every year that includes all the agents and all the publishers and what they specialize in. And so what I did was I went to that and I looked for everyone who did parenting or motherhood or self-help. And then I also then looked what books that they had signed or published. And so when I went to query an agent, I would I made a list of the ones who did the kind of work that I did. And then I started querying those. But I only did 5 at a time. And that was some of the best advice someone gave me. Only send out 5 queries to an agent at a time. So then if you get rejections and they give you advice, you can change it based on what they say. Sometimes they don't even respond or send anything back, which is maddening. But for those who did, and they were like, well, you know what, if it had a little bit more of this, or redo it and send it back to me. So you don't want to send it to 40 people at a time and then it not be something that they're interested in. Send it to a small cluster, 5 or 6, and then wait for the responses and then send it out to the next batch. And similarly, I did the same thing once I had an agent and we were looking for a publisher. She would only send it to a small batch at a time to see what the responses were. And I was really lucky that I found an agent probably in my round 2 or 3, and then I found a publisher in round 2. So it was really kind of lucky, but I think that was some of the best advice I got.
That is wonderful advice. Alicia, how did you get your agent, or did you go straight from proposal to publishing?
That's what I just wanted to asterisk Erica's comment. I think, am I the only fiction writer, I believe, of the crowd? So I think going out with a full book is really important if this is your first fiction book. So that's just something to take into consideration too. But I know that for almost all forms of nonfiction, it's proposal driven, right?
It's a proposal, and you write 2 chapters or so, and then that's included in the proposal in addition to a bio, how you're different than the competition, all this other about the market and all this other stuff. So the proposal is, I think, very important for nonfiction, at least in my experience.
Yeah, and the proposal is also pretty formulaic. Once you understand what comprises a proposal, it falls into place relatively easily. But as I had a very similar experience as Erica, in that my first couple of drafts of trying to get to a proposal, it was agonizing. It was just how do I sell this? Because it's a sales document. It's not the writing itself. Yeah. But I was going to say, it's now Publishers Marketplace online has a lot of, you can get $25 a month subscription to Publishers Marketplace, and you can track. And another really great resource is just the acknowledgements sections of books that you like. If for me, there were a couple of books on youth culture in various, slightly complicated, politically complex places, and I looked at the acknowledgement section, and everyone thanks their agents. So that's a really good place to figure out where what you want to be aiming for.
It took me a long time to figure that out, Julia, but yes, that's a fantastic way to go about it.
Fantastic. And then the maddening, you get through all that, you're like, my proposal's perfect, I love it, and you're somewhat perfect, and then the whole sales component to it, and you realize that this is actually a business, and you're like, no, it's an art. I'm an artist. I want to write the story. I want to share. I want to help people. I want to self, and then it's like, how many Instagram followers do you have, and who knows you, and that's the maddening, that whole like, but you know what? That's not another reason to get discouraged either, because I got hung up on that. I was like, my first book was a cookbook, and I was like, no one knows me. Who's gonna want to read my cookbook? Like, you know. But if your voice is original, if you have a point of view, if you have, so I don't, you know, we often get so hung up on the I can't that we don't even try, and so. But all that, this is all such great advice. I love the short, only five submissions, using the Publishers Weekly, grabbing the groups. I find that you'll find someone. If you want this badly enough, someone will, you know, and which brings us to, you know, the rejection and the pain that comes with this. Okay, so now you have written your beautiful work, or your proposal, or your complete book. You have gotten this wonderful agent who's promised you the sun, the moon, and the stars, and you believe them. Now you get published. It's amazing. It's fantastic. And enter the dreaded criticism and or praise, and sometimes often in the same review. I had someone call me the next Nora Ephron in one, it was like the Amazon reviews, and then I was glowing, and then the next review was, I will quote, "This was the worst book I ever read." So rejection, criticism, from the proposal part, from the getting the agent, and then from like putting it out there. Is there anything you could say about sticking with it, tenacity, anything that kept you going through, you know, reading "This was the worst book I ever read"?
So this is kind of connecting to the last comment about agents also. Sometimes, so first of all, sometimes a rejection or a criticism is not actually a rejection. My first agent, I've had two agents. My first agent sent what I thought was a rejection to my Cuba book, and I read her email aloud to my mother, and my mother, who is far more tenacious than I, was like, "I don't think that's really a rejection. She's offering you a very clear path toward revision, per Erica's point. And so if you really want to be working with this person, you need to work a little bit harder." So I think the ability to kind of discern, to read between the lines of rejection and criticism, I think it's really hard to stay that open and that consistently vulnerable to like be looking at bad reviews of this thing that you've spent so many years of your life and you've sacrificed in any number of different ways to create, and then someone just slams it. You know, there are people who are not thinking or feeling or whatever, but then sometimes in the criticism there's something really valid or an interesting perspective to consider. And again, it sometimes being that vulnerable can be really a hard position to maintain, a hard stance. Yeah. And I at least float in and out of being able to see those criticisms, and sometimes I just have to shut it all out. But you know, sometimes it can be really helpful to help me get better.
Yeah, definitely.
So I do think that you have to prepare yourself. When you're a writer, you have to prepare yourself for the rejection from the start. Even if you're like a journalist, you have editors who will rip apart your work. That's your first taste of rejection if you're a journalist. But then as time, you know, as you develop into a writer and you want to write books, just know that not everyone's going to see your vision, and you're going to find an agent or a publisher who does. Right. And then you also, when you do get rejections, I mean, I know I'm going back to the querying an agent and publisher part, but when you do get rejections, it's not always about your work. It's about maybe they've already signed a book that's similar to yours, or something that, or they've had too many of this type of book on their roster, so they can't take it. So don't take it as a rejection of your ability. Just take it as that this wasn't the right piece for them right now, and you will find a home for it. And you really can't give up. I know that sounds a little hokey, but you can't. There are very famous writers out there, J.K. Rowling, Stephen, I forgot his last name, but there's so many famous writers out there who have been rejected and who are now bestsellers and some of the most famous writers in the world. So you have to keep going. And when it comes to when your book comes out and someone doesn't like it, I mean, I love that Julia takes it as constructive criticism. I'm just like, well, this isn't the book for them. I'm like, fine, they don't like it, that's not for them. So I think a part of you have to, you sold it, it's out there, you've gotten positive feedback, own that and keep that in mind, right?
Yeah,
That's how I kind of cope with that.
Definitely, Erica. And it's like, and you did it. Like I had an aunt come over to me and she was just, she asked me to, basically criticized me about that I didn't include something that she thought was so part of my life story and blah, 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 blah. And I just looked at her and I was like, but I wrote a book and it was published. It's like, the journey in which to get there. We're doers, and there's a sense of accomplishment in that. So sometimes it almost makes you a little Teflon to the insults because you know how hard it was to get there.
Yeah.
Alicia, did you have anything to?
I feel like I agree with everything that's been said. I also feel like I have two different answers for rejection and criticism, right? So like the rejection to me, I associate that more with like agents and editors, and I think at that point the product is not final, right? It's still malleable, it's still being worked on, it's still open to interpretation and to like the final form that you're going to choose, right? So it's taken me like over a decade to get here, but I try to see rejection, much like you were saying, both of you, as it is a learning process, right? If you can find patterns in the rejection and that rejection is valuable and they're saying something that's going to elevate the work, fantastic, right? And I can take that and after a couple days I can apply it to the work and it helps. Like the point is to get the best product possible. But once it sells, the book is fine, or whatever it is, the article, the essay, the book is final. There's no going back to it. So yes, of course, for that first month, I'm obsessively checking Goodreads or publications to see how people are receiving it. But then I cut myself off because there's nothing to be done with that. And so it's just a little bit different what stage I'm at. And I'm better talking about that than actually doing it. Sometimes a month is 3, so.
I also find that I have to forget that I'm going to exist in public in order to write again. So now, a book of mine came out last year in March, and now I'm working on my next book, and it makes me physically uncomfortable to see articles about that previous book because it has to be in the rear view. Like Alicia's saying, it has to be done, put aside, no revising if I'm going to write another word.
And so there's a letting go to all this too. And Alicia and maybe Julia, I'm sorry, but your books have been optioned perhaps for TV or film? Both of you. Okay.
One for me too.
Perfect. Okay. And you guys did it. You pulled the trigger, you let go, and it's out there. So I blew up 2 option deals because I couldn't take my hands off the stories and the trust that I needed to have to give these stories to someone else to adapt. And Harlan Coben, who's had 97 books and movies made about his, he gave me great advice. He's like, when Netflix calls, you say yes. How did you let go of, I'd love to know that. How was that process for you, the optioning process?
I have an excellent agent who I trust completely. And so I think that's a huge part of it. My life and my career would be very different if I didn't work with the agent that I have. So I'm really grateful for. And then I think I need to be working on something else. My focus is on my next book right now. And as much as I still enjoy talking to people about the jet age stewardesses, about whom I wrote a book, that's not where my heart is anymore. So I think having a different place to be focusing on, really, I don't know that I would have been able to let go as easily.
Did we lose Mary?
I lost. Are you guys here?
I don't see it either.
We don't see you, but we might hear you.
We're here.
Wait, hold on.
Okay.
Ah,
Oh, yay.
that was my book agent. Sorry, Alicia, go ahead.
No. Agreed with Julia. I trust my agent. I also think that I might not be the best storyteller in that medium, even for my own work, right? And so just for as much as I would maybe like to be, I might not be. And this actually was a lesson that, and I know we talked a little bit about this behind the scenes, that I had taken a lot of courses with Professor Glavin at Georgetown, and he had done this project where we put together a screenplay, or maybe it was a play, and then other students in the class acted it out. And I still remember that moment where the work felt like something on the page. And then I like got chills seeing these actors bring, you know, my work to life in a way that I'm like, I wouldn't have done it that way, but oh my God, this is amazing. And it was just, that just stayed with me so much that, you know, there's so many different ways to tell the story, and your way might not always be the best in every medium, right? Like, so that sort of, it was just like a lifelong lesson. Anyway, for what that's worth.
Letting go. Yep. And I like the idea of moving on from a project. It's like, that was complete, let's move on, and there's more to do. Okay, so we talked about criticism, we talked about getting noticed, we talked about letting go. Now, I think we touched upon it a little bit, but I'd love to go back to a little bit more of the daily practice. What makes you a writer? You know, you know, how do you find the time, juggling Erica, you know, family and having it all, you know, that question about how do you, what makes you a writer? What when you wake up every day and you say, I'm a writer, well, how do you do it?
Yeah. Well, when I first became a writer, what made you a writer was being published, right? That was the old-fashioned definition. And like I said, I started at People magazine, so there's nothing that makes you feel more like a writer than being in a national magazine. But I think now it's completely different. I think people can become writers by doing it themselves. You can start a blog, you can submit work to online magazines or websites, or you can just start writing and start creating something that you're going to turn into something bigger. So I do think that if you sit down and write, and and your purpose is to share your writing, I think you're a writer. Like that's how I think the definition has evolved. You can self-publish even. I know a lot of writers who self-publish. So I feel like you don't have to go by an old-fashioned definition of what it means to be a writer. You have to create and I think share it.
Yes. Alicia. No, go ahead.
Want to say something?
That's good.
No, go ahead, Alicia. I was going to ask Erica, do you write every day?
I do not. I write about 4 days a week. And I'm also still a very active journalist. So I do a lot of, reporting and writing. And for me, I really wish I had this process of getting up in the morning and writing 2 hours. I get up with my kids, I take them to school, and then I go to a workspace. I cannot write at home. It is I have no inspiration at home at all. Writing during the pandemic was very hard for me. So I go to a workspace and I like noise. I like things being hectic around me. That's a very unusual practice. Not everyone's like that, but I'll work at a common workspace where there are people around. And then when that closes, I'll go to a 24-hour diner, especially when I'm on deadline. I also love going to this place called the Soho Diner. It's not open 24 hours anymore, but I remember when I had chapter deadlines, the workspace would close at like 8, then I'd go to the Soho Diner and stay there till like 3, and write and then go home, sleep a couple hours, get up with my kids. But that's only the nights I was on deadline, because I'm really one of those people who writes up until it's due. I've never been able to write it's done 3 weeks early. It's never happened for me. So I think everyone has a different process and you have to find out what works for you. For me, it's noise. I don't want people talking to me, but I want things going on around me. So you have to find what gets your juices flowing, what gets you able to create. And it'll be different for everyone. So.
Great answer. You guys want to take this?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think I completely agree, Erica. It'll be different for everyone, and it'll change over time too. I think, I had kids a couple of years ago, and so I'm still in the process of adjusting. I have very little ones, and I'm still in the process of realizing how things are different now versus, when before I had kids. I thought I knew exactly how it worked. My old habits are not going to fit in my new life. So how to kind of be elastic with that. But I do agree that being a writer is it's writing. and having the intention of sharing that writing. I think one of the most freeing things that I realized was, you know, I had twins 14 months ago, and I was not writing. I was having babies and preparing to launch a book. And I felt really empty and very sad, and, you know, I felt like I would never write again. And it was really, really tough for a minute. And I read an interview with someone or in her interview, I legitimately forget what author this was, but someone said that they wrote their book 150 words at a time. And I found that just so incredibly freeing. And I just started taking notes at 100 words in my phone every day. And it just kind of got me back on course. So, you know, having that level of flexibility, both in terms of figuring out what works for you and changing that, but then also the rigor to just keep going, not quit.
And I would just echo all of this. I think it's very wise. And just to underscore one thing that Erica said a while ago about success in the writing space, meaning being published. And I think that was what I struggled with for a long time, because if that's what it meant and I didn't succeed, then I wasn't what I felt I was in my heart. And I think a writer writes, period. And if this is a vocation, you're dedicated to the craft, you're dedicated to elevating your work and being the best writer possible. And there are so many venues now, as both Erica and Julia were saying, and it has to be about the work or the love of the game, to use a sports metaphor, because to make it about success, I think almost guts the joy out of it, or rather about publication in that sort of traditional sense.
Yeah, I think when you could sit back, even again, being alone as a writer, which we're often a lot, and you read that one, it's just that moment of like that one page or that one sentence that like, or you make yourself laugh, or you're like, oh, that was good. Like I'll sometimes go back and just to actually jumpstart writing again, I'll go back and like read an essay that I loved and that I had written. It's easier than Googling yourself every day. And so I just, that one sentence that I just like, that came out of me magically, it will inspire me to say like, I guess I'm okay with this. I want to keep going. So that helps. And
can I add one?
Yes.
So can I add one thing? I totally think that if you're someone who gets inspiration on the fly, you should carry, even in your little bag, like a little notebook where you can write down ideas, even if it's something like a nugget of what would be in the 5th chapter of some book, or some little scene setter if you're a fiction writer, or some little like idea for a great nonfiction work. I do think that part of being a writer is finding inspiration in the world around you. You've got to listen, you've got to look, you've got to like kind of take in the world and give yourself the chance to remember what you see. Because sometimes I even forget, I'm like, oh, that would be a great idea. And then I'm like at home, what was that thing I saw earlier today? So I carry around a little notebook with me, tiny, in my bag.
It's the greatest thing. And David Sedaris, who we all know and love, and he's one of the greatest observers of observing writers. I've had the joy of watching him. I live near Central Park, and as does he, and he walks every day. And you are literally watching him observe. I'll see him like walk up closer to like 2 people talking, and I'm like, I know he's getting copy. He is definitely.
Yes, totally.
Well, you can find inspiration. Elizabeth Gilbert says it best, like she'll be staring at a screen and then like a bird will fly past her and it will remind her of like this time her mother took her to Kansas and so it's like being open to those divine, like I'll be on the subway sometimes and then I'll get a story and but 9 out of 10 times you forget that moment. And that's why that book or that little note in your phone is so important.
And if you write fiction, maybe one on the bedside table too. I've actually woken up in the middle of the night. I'm like, this is so weird, but it could work, maybe. As long as you can read your own handwriting when you wake up.
Totally.
Yeah.
I do find,
I mean, I'll see those notes and I'll be like, what?
Like,
that doesn't make any sense. Those words don't even go together to mean anything.
Touche.
Have you been woken up by a book that you're like? Have you been woken up by a thought or something you're working on? It wakes you up so much, and then you're like, I have to include that. That happens to me sometimes. Like it comes to me while I'm sleeping.
Sometimes if I'm up at night anyway, I'll chew on an idea, and then I'll wake up in the next morning. It's sort of ironed itself out a little bit.
I love it. I love it. This is, guys, we could talk for hours. I'm so enjoying this. Okay. Hope you guys are too. All 9 million of you out there. Okay. So, I think, we're going to go to Q&A soon, but before that, if you could distill it to, or a couple things, or we want to leave people inspired. We want to leave them with something. What was the one thing someone told you, a teacher, a professor, perhaps at Georgetown, someone who gave you either great advice or just that, like, you can do it? Do you have that moment? Is that to acknowledge that moment or that person or that book or that movie or whatever it was, that you would pass on advice to a writer who is thinking about entering this industry, or just is stalled, or, like we said, like anything that helped you really helped you along, either whether it be a writing practice or just something that gave you the can do.
For me, I have very
no, go ahead.
I just have a very clear I took 2 classes my senior year. One was with Nora Tilden at Georgetown, who is it was nonfiction, creative nonfiction writing, which changed my whole world. And that was great. And she was incredibly encouraging. And I don't remember any specific thing that she said to me, but I do remember feeling just excited every time I left her class. The other thing was I took a class with a professor whose name I forget, but the class was American Expatriate Writers. And he allowed me, I read The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway. And rather than write an essay, I walked into his office hours and I started complaining about how I really didn't think that the way the book ended was how it should have ended, that Hemingway had kind of, he walk away from Brett. This was BS. Hemingway didn't know what he was doing. And the hubris of it did not strike me until years later. But the professor said, so why don't you rewrite it? And he let me do a stylistic analysis of Hemingway and rewrite the last 3 pages of the book in Hemingway's. And he said, it's got to read like Hemingway. If this is going to pass for an essay and I'm going to let you off without writing an essay, you better be bulletproof. You better be able to mimic Hemingway to the nth degree. And I tend to write long, even now. That exercise completely shifted my notion of how, what style is, and what a writing voice is, and how plastic it is. So that was one of the most impactful, incredible things. And I highly encourage anyone to just mimic anyone they like or admire.
Mm-hmm. For me, I came to Georgetown intent on being a lawyer. I was a government major, English minor, but I had 2 professors who really did shift my future, Pamela Fox and Elizabeth Velez. And they, kind of exposed me to this world of writing and how fun and fulfilling it could be. And, Professor Velez was always like, don't be a lawyer. Don't be a lawyer. And actually, she helped me get my first job as a journalist. I was an intern she helped me get an internship at People magazine, which obviously changed the direction of my entire future. And I'm so grateful for it. Sometimes it's exposure to what we can do that we don't know what we can do until we try it. And I think that's a lot of what writing is. It's trying. I mean, if you don't know if you want to do fiction or nonfiction, try them both, right? Write a screenplay. Try to go out there and write a book about your community or some of your experience. I think you can write what you know, but you can also write what you, like we talked about earlier, what you don't know or what you want or need. I think there's really a book inside of almost everyone. There's at least a few essays, if not a whole book. So I really think it's about being exposed, and being encouraged. Those 2 professors were so encouraging and taught me so much about writing. I'm incredibly grateful that I took them both, and they're friends to this day.
Love that.
And I feel like I've answered this question just with Professor John Glavin. I think I honestly took 4 classes with him. So when I think of writing in Georgetown, it will always be Professor Glavin. And I learned so many things. I mean, over the course of 2 or maybe it was even 3 years, looking back, I'm not sure. But Julie and I were talking about this idea that he made his students write morning pages, and you would have to every single day of college, which I think is no small feat, right? You would have to write college. Yeah, yes, college. Right. So you'd have to get up and had to be in the morning, and you had to write 3 loose leaf pages. Maybe it was 5, but maybe 3 to 5 pages, and you'd have to put it in an envelope and deliver it So he knew you did it every day. And that's discipline, that's showing up, that's doing the work. It was a fantastic, I mean, I honestly, I have like a whole list of things I've learned from those various classes, but yes, very impactful in so many different ways, because writing it's, as we've all been saying, it's sticking with it, it's putting in the time. Yeah.
Not giving up, not giving up. Yeah, my best advice was, I was in 8th grade, Mrs. Weinberg, and I thank her in my book, both books, because I handed in a paper and it was like a murder scene. It was marked every other word, red ink, red ink, red ink, correction, red ink, red ink. But there was an A+ on top of it. And I wasn't an A+ student. And it was like the first A+. And I brought the paper up to her and I was like, Mrs. Weinberg, clearly there's, you know, a mistake here. Like, this is, everything's wrong. And you wrote like A+. I got an A, like, and she goes, she took off her glasses. I'll never forget this. I love this woman. And she goes, Mary, don't get hung up on the fact that your grammar is terrible and your spelling is atrocious. You're a very good writer. Keep writing. And that just like that little optimism and belief in me, I was like, I can go to Georgetown. Mrs. Weinberg said I'm a good writer. And then I remember being outside White Gravener and taking, you know, I was an English major, a theater minor with Bradley Cooper. I remember I took a class, Dr. Don B. Murphy. Did you guys ever take Performing Arts and Contemporary Society? And he was an amazing professor. I don't think he's at Georgetown any longer. I still hope he's still on this earth, but he really believed in the idea of dreaming without boundaries and delusional optimism, which I believe has propelled a lot of my success in my career, all of that. I think simply by being, clearly we see it, being in this, surrounded in this soup of greatness of people that get to be at Georgetown together. And I only wished I could go back and take all of those English classes again now.
Totally agree with that.
And I think your point about delusional optimism also, though, is really important. And I think we all, in our pre-chat moment, I don't think we talked enough about rejection here, and just the fact of, like, if you're not going to believe in yourself and your writing, who is? And, you know, I think men are really socialized to keep at it. I will never forget that moment with my mom when she was like, that's not a rejection. You think that's a rejection. Like, I was so sensitive to being rejected that I created a rejection for myself. When in reality, you know, we just have to keep at it and have that delusional optimism.
Absolutely. And I think more so gathering like this, sharing, paying it forward, sharing the gift. We are still, women and minorities are still the most underpublished out there, even today with all of us, you know, roaring. So we must support, we must build, we must help. You know, I have made it almost part of my practice that anyone who comes to me and says, I have a book in me, I try the hardest to connect them with someone who can help. So I think that's really, really our responsibility too, to pay it, to do that. So we have like 10 minutes left, or maybe a little less. I don't know, I'm bad at using the technology here, but do we have any questions? I'd love to put questions out. It could just be broad questions, it could be directed questions, or we could start singing some karaoke together, whatever you think.
Back up, definitely back
up. Hi, Mary. Oh, I'm sorry. We do have a lot of questions in the chat. The question section is buzzing. There are so many people who are wanting your advice and your expertise. And, you know, there are so many here, and I want to try to get through as many as we can. But the conversation that we were just having kind of leads really well into this first question. So we know we were kind of talking about that self-doubt, right? And so someone would like to know, you know, what are your thoughts on imposter syndrome, or the self-doubt, right, that specifically comes from sharing your story with the world? You know, can you talk about that doubt as to whether, you know, your topic is worthy of a book, or how you know your story is worthy of being told?
And one quick answer. Oh, sorry. And I think I'm going to be quoting like one. I just heard that if you don't have imposter syndrome, then you are not a successful human being. Like the people who do not question and or think they have imposter syndrome, they're the ones that need some help. I totally did not. But Erica, please say that a lot more eloquently than I just did.
I don't think I can, but I was going to say, if you're interested in it, if you have a passion for it or you're curious about something, I guarantee you there are thousands of others who share that, right? Just because you don't live next door to them or they don't work in your office doesn't mean they're not out there. So it is like, I think, writers are artists and artists are sensitive, right? I've written thousands of articles, and before every single article comes out, I'm like, ooh, I hope it's good, or ooh, I hope it reads well. And it's just something it may follow you for the rest of your life, but there's a part of you that also has to know, like Julia said, like men are conditioned very differently, right? We're so concerned about how things are going to be perceived or received. So I think a part of it, you have to get a little gumption and a little kick-ass mindset that you can do this and that you're not an imposter. If you have an idea, you have a good idea, you have the ability to follow through, then do it. Because, self-doubt is just in human nature. So you just have to kind of fight through it.
Yeah, my whole thing, my answer was going to be that you're not alone. I mean, I think we all, everybody feels that way. Publishing is such a weird thing. Writing is such a weird thing. It's a part of your soul that's kind of like packaged for commercial purposes, right? Like there's something very odd about that, so it's part of the process. And I think with every book I go through it, it's never done.
Ever. It's just published.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think I don't know that there's any, I literally have no actual advice other than to say that you have to figure out what works for you to move through it. And I think different people have different things. Like for me, I was just telling the panelists before we went live that I just sold my third book to my dream publishing house, dream editor. It's like an absolute dream. I've been working on it with tons of, motivation and feeling great. And then in the last 2 weeks, I've hit this wall and I'm like, I'm not an expert on this. What am I talking about? These words don't sound good. I don't know what I'm doing. And so, I think you never will be immune to it. And figuring out for me, what works is just shifting it up. I'm going to take a week away from it and start writing something else, and then come back to it with fresh eyes. And, I'll just work on, you have different coping mechanisms. I also really rely on a group of close friends. I have a writing group that I've been writing with for 10 years now. And there are 4 of us. And whenever one of us is feeling too, whatever about something, we really do lean on each other. So finding people like that, I think, also really matters.
Yeah, actually, Julia is absolutely right. You have to, and if you're feeling insecure about something or not sure if something is good, you have to be open to editing and criticism. I remember the very first iterations of my book, I actually sent to Professor Velez, and she didn't love all of it, but I listened to her advice and I listened to her criticism, and some of it I took, some of it I didn't, and that's your choice as a writer. But you have to be open to the people who care about you and want to help you. Be open to what they have to say, because they're not always going to agree with you, and that's okay, because that's why you're giving them your pages, or you're asking them for notes to help you get better and to have something that is publishable.
Thank you all so much for your answers. I have another question, which is also kind of broad, and I'm going to mix together a couple questions here. So do you ever encounter conflict in your roles as authors, contributors, journalists, business owners? And, we have another question here specifically that talks about, dealing with conflict or tension between wanting to maintain creative control versus an editor or publisher maybe wanting to make changes that you don't agree with or you don't think are necessary. How do you generally navigate conflict, and even how do you navigate that specific type of conflict?
I have, so I'm going to say something that's going to connect with the previous, with imposter syndrome also. I think it's really useful to enroll in writing workshops, even if you're not sure what kind of a writer you want to be or how serious you want to be or whatever. There are a lot of different ways to do that. I know Sackett Street Writing in New York, has a lot of writing workshops that you don't necessarily have to be involved in a degree granting program to participate in. I think what's so useful about that, both for imposter syndrome and for learning to navigate conflict, is that it can teach you what are the things that you are willing to give on, and what are the things that you're not. And I think part of how you hone that, or how at least I honed that, was reading other people's writing and commenting on it, and figuring out how to frame things, and then having my own work critiqued by other people, and doing that repetitively really, it more importantly than actually improving the work itself, it helped me figure out, no, this is what's important that I'm doing, and if I'm not doing this in the right way, if it's not getting across this way, then I need to do that differently, but I'm not going to do it the way that this person is telling me to do it. So just figuring out what you can give on and what you can't, that'll help in both of those regards.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything they want to share to that question?
I was going to give a very general answer, but hopefully it's helpful, is that it's kind of a shifting framework to me too, this idea of conflict being inevitable. I think when I got into writing at first, I kind of pictured it as a solo endeavor, and it's really not, especially if you work with an agent, you work with an editor. My next 2 books are actually, I have a co-writer, right? So every part of the process we are working together. And I think understanding that the work is malleable, it is going to be changed, and just bringing a respect and just an acknowledgement that whoever you're working with is bringing the desire to make things better to the table, regardless of how it comes across. That's what is at the heart of it. And as my background as a lawyer, I try to treat everybody like a client, even my co-writer, and I'm their client, right? Because it's you care about the work, right? So you can get heated over things, they're personal. So just kind of adopting that framework, easier said than done, of course, but.
I wrote an essay about infertility and miscarriaging and endometriosis, which is, I have all 3, check all 3 boxes. And I remember writing this piece, and it was so personal and so like, I shared some things in there that I didn't even share with my family. And I remember my editor like telling me, no, it's a little too much. And I was like, what? But she was right in the way, but my first was like, my immediate was like, this is my story. Like, you don't, but the way in which, so I think going back again, it's all about that trust, and trusting your editor, trusting that they want to put the best work out, and picking the things that you absolutely will not back down on. So pick your fights. It's like anything, like, and I think once you realize you're not going to win all of them, you prioritize the ones that you really want to win, the things that you know need, these words must be put out there. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I know we're so close to time here. We have so many questions, and I wish we could get to them all, but I just want to take a moment and, is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience before to wrap things up? Anyone have any parting thoughts?
Write that book. You can do it. If I could do it, you could do it. No, I love spending time with you guys.
Well, thank you. Thank you all so much. I personally am feeling so empowered, and I know that I'm sure some of our attendees are feeling empowered too, watch out world. But I want to take a moment to thank you all so much for joining us today, for sharing your stories, for sharing your experience, and for, being vulnerable here with our audience. A million thank yous. We can't thank you enough for being here. And we want to thank our audience as well for joining us today and for taking some time to be here with us today. Please, like I mentioned before, look out for a follow-up email from us. We'll include a link to the recording and some upcoming events that you can also take advantage of. But until then, again, thank you to everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.